It's the week ending Saturday the 14th of July, and this is The Week Unwrapped, brought to you by Barclays Corporate Banking. In the past 7 days, we've seen 2 cabinet ministers quitting the UK government, Donald Trump ruffling feathers at NATO, and Russia and England, beaten by France and Croatia, respectively, in the World Cup semi-finals. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team are Rebecca Gillie and Hollie Clemence, and from the week junior, it's Felicity Capon. Starting the show this week, it's Rebecca, though. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
The Brexit referendum may have been the best thing that happened to UK immigrants.
It's all about immigration, right? It's not about trade or Europe or anything like that. It's all about immigration. It's to stop the Muslims from coming into this country. Simple as that.
Do you think you voted to leave the EU to stop Muslims coming to the country?
To stop immigration.
Right.
But the movement of people in Europe, fair enough. But not from Africa, Syria, Iraq, everywhere else. It's all wrong.
A man from Barnsley talking to Channel 4 News back in 2016, just after Brexit. Rebecca, what's the story this week?
So the story this week is that the latest edition of the British Social Attitude Survey has come out. It measures how the average Brit feels about a variety of social issues, including immigration. And it actually had quite an unusual finding, which is that people have become markedly more positive about immigrants and immigration since the EU referendum.
Markedly, you say?
Markedly.
Tell us the marks.
Well, I won't bore you with too many statistics, but
Just
basically the figures have almost reversed in terms of percentages since the survey of 2011, when 41% of people said that immigration was negative for the UK culture, 21% said it was positive. Now this year it's almost reversed. 47% says that it has been good for Britain's culture, and only 17% say that immigration has been bad for Britain's culture.
OK, what do you think are the reasons for the sudden upswing?
Well, this is what's really fascinating about it, is that the survey is just a measurement of how people feel. It doesn't ask them follow-up questions on why. So it's open to interpretation, really. And I think there's several different ways you could look at it. For instance, you could look at this as, now that we are facing a situation where lots of sectors are going to be short of workers, when we have fewer migrants from the EU, people are starting to feel a bit more fondly about those workers. Or you could suggest that people who voted Remain are now looking on supporting immigrants as kind of a political stance. Or you could come to the conclusion that the Leave campaign was right, and that it wasn't ever about xenophobia, and that even though people do want to leave the EU, it doesn't mean that they are anti-immigrant.
Felicity.
I think it could be to do with a rush of stories recently which place immigrants and migration in a more positive light, in a way. So I think you've got stories like the 70th anniversary of the NHS, where lots of focus on nurses and doctors who have come in from other countries and the positive impact they've made in the country. You had the Windrush scandal, which has been huge, and people have been understandably outraged about how people from the Caribbean have been treated in this country. You had Trump and migrants on the US-Mexico border, and everyone's furious with Trump. And then you've got Italy refusing migrants from the Aquarius, and Spain sort of being the hero and accepting them. And I feel like there's just been a glut of stories, maybe, which has sort of said, hang on a second, these people are getting treated really, really badly, and we're more sympathetic to them than perhaps we have been in the past.
And also possibly, Hollie, that actually immigration is still a massive concern, but with the Leave vote, I mean, rightly or wrongly, as we just said in that clip, intellectually, but with the Leave vote, people got that out their system and then asked the question, do migrants make a positive contribution to the economy? We'll say in a more sort of rational, economically analysing way, yes, whereas before they might have said no because they were angry about it. They've now had their say.
Yeah, I think there is an element of that. It was a protest vote. People have got it out of the system, like you say.
And they have changed immigration policy. When we come out of Europe, we will have more control over immigration.
Although it hasn't changed yet, which is interesting, and those attitudes have changed. It was a kind of a cue for voters to sit back and relax, perhaps, that were worried and wanted to make their voice known. They've had their say, and now they can think about it maybe more rationally. I think Felicity's right as well. There's been a big media coverage of the NHS. As Gary Young says in The Guardian, the institution that we value the most has been sustained by people who we value the least. And I think there has been a change. And Windrush, I mean, we got rid of a Home Secretary over immigration. I don't feel like that would have happened before 2016.
But Rebecca, nonetheless, citizens here and across the EU still rank immigration as the number one priority. When it comes to elections, it will be back on the leaflets again. So can you reconcile those two views?
Well, I actually think that immigration is slightly fading from most voters' agendas in the sense that now Theresa May's new reshuffled cabinet is now more heavily favoured towards people who have stood up for immigration. Some of the hardliners are now gone. Boris Johnson, has said some pretty harsh things about immigration in the past. He's now gone. So it could be that Theresa May decides to kind of minimise the issue of immigration in the next election, which looks like it might be extremely soon.
There was also an article in the Spectator this week that said with the sort of recent reshuffles in the cabinet, you now have three very prominent politicians in the cabinet, Jeremy Hunt, Sajid Javid and Philip Hammond, who all had successful private sector careers before politics and all sort of had this awareness that the UK economy and public finances currently rely on fairly easy access to international labour. So I think you might see a shift on how this current cabinet feels about immigration. And also, I agree with Rebecca. I think people are probably more stressed about a trade deal and securing a trade with Brexit than they are about immigration. I feel that has faded in comparison to the deal that we strike.
Yeah, and just to pick up on the economic angle as well, it just goes to show how much emotion plays into attitudes towards immigration among the general public, because it's always been true that immigrants have contributed more to the economy than they've taken away, but people just emotionally haven't bought into that logic because it's never really been a tangible issue. But now with Brexit on the table, I think average people are starting to think a lot more maybe than they did before about the actual economic impact of what it would mean if we had a massive drop in
But that's the
workforce.
problem, isn't it, with this question being one that's about asking the general public what they think about basically an economic policy. Rather, you said that the survey was about how they feel, but it's not. It's asking them actually, do immigrants make a positive or negative impact on the economy? And that is separate to how they feel. Our chap in Barnsley will not have changed his mind. He will still feel that, the shops around him have become shops for people from Pakistan and Afghanistan or whatever it is, that the schools around him no longer have majority white faces. That's what he's concerned about. And actually Brexit, arguably from his point of view, would make that worse because we're still going to need the immigrants, as you point out, and they're going to come from countries outside the EU.
Yeah,
now.
absolutely.
So that doesn't mean that immigration goes away as an issue, does it?
No, of course not. And I think if there's anything that we've learned from the rise of populism, it's that politicians need to start paying attention to how people feel, even if they're wrong. Do you know what I mean? I think that's what we learned, is that you can't just tell people, they told the electorate again and again, immigrants are a positive, contribution. They make a net positive contribution to the country. And people just didn't feel like it was true. And that is why they voted the way they have. And we've seen similar scenarios in other countries, across Europe and the US as well, is that we do need to start taking stock of how people feel and as well as, the facts.
I wonder if there'll be a backlash to the backlash if Brexit doesn't end up being hard Brexit and people are outraged by it. If Nigel Farage comes back in, takes over UKIP again, whether that wave could return next year maybe. It depends what Theresa May ends up agreeing with the EU.
Felicity.
But the Chequers agreement that was decided last Friday, it does contain a promise to formally end free movement, but it will be replaced with a mobility agreement that could well mean EU migration continues more or less at the same level. So I think it's quite ambiguous at the moment, isn't it, as what could happen in future. But I also wonder that now Brexit is looming and we've sort of seen stories of people going back home to countries in the EU and the NHS has a massive shortage. I wonder whether we're sort of seeing our chickens come home to roost, that we're actually seeing what the UK would look like if we didn't have all the immigrants that we need.
And immigration is linked to how people feel about the economy, whether they realise that or not, isn't it? When you look at these studies, Rebecca, that's what it says. When the economy is doing well, people are less concerned about immigration. When it's doing badly, they're more concerned about immigration. Maybe that's a scapegoat. So I guess whether this is a long-term trend or not, people feeling more positive about immigrants might be predicated on whether or not it's economically successful to do whichever level of Brexit we end up having.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, anti-immigrant sentiment in the survey peaked in 2011, which was, getting into the aftermath of the financial crash. So we can definitely see that. And yeah, it's going to depend a lot on what Brexit ends up looking like, I think. Next
up this week is Hollie. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Is infighting from the feminist movement of the 1970s making a return?
There has been an anti-trans protest at the very start of a parade. Some lesbians laid down in front of a parade. They believe that the Pride movement is too LGBT, and I think the emphasis is on T, inclusive, and they believe that trans identities somehow erase lesbian identities. some of the language they've used is really quite nastily transphobic. It's talking about trans people being rapists, which there is no evidence for whatsoever, in fact, quite the opposite. So it is a bit of a nasty start, but we'll soon be past that and into the officially approved parade.
That was Tris Reed-Smith, editor of Gay Star News, reporting at the start of London Pride on Saturday. Now, Holly, this was big news this week for many people, but actually a story that I'm sure did fly under the radar of many of our straight, non-trans listeners. What happened on Saturday?
Basically, a small anti-trans group hijacked the Pride in London parade. They stood on the rainbow flag and then organisers kind of let them lead the parade for about 45 minutes. There's been controversy over whether they should have let them. They've since condemned it, and various lesbian and women's groups have condemned it. But the stunt, some campaigners say, illustrates how anti-trans bigotry has reached fever pitch. And some of those anti-trans bigots, if you will, are from a kind of minority group of feminists, which is historically goes back to the 1970s. There was an internal fight over trans women, how they should be perceived, and it seems to have kind of reared its head again.
What do they, in a nutshell, believe?
Well, the specific group that was campaigning, it was a very small amount. It was kind of fewer than 10 people. They're called Get the L Out, as in get the lesbian out of LGBT, because they couldn't get the T out in previous campaigning. It's a fringe lesbian and feminist protest group that have made these on-evidence claims that lesbians are being silenced by trans people, women and girls are at risk, and their interests are taking a backseat to the transgender community. It's an academic tension between the feminist idea that women can look and act in any way they want, without any question to their womanhood, but the trans idea that you have to look a certain way to be a woman. But on a practical level, it's like, should trans women be in women's toilets, in women's spaces, women's refuges,
so
on
it
women-only
ties
lists?
into some of the controversy around Germaine Greer and what she's been saying, isn't it? Which is that actually there is an argument that if you're a feminist, that's about women. It's about people with vaginas. It's not about people that may or may not have vaginas but were born as men.
That is Greer's kind of view, yeah. She's basically denied trans women right to say that they're women.
Yeah. Okay. What do people think the Pride organisers should have done? Because it's very loaded, this idea that they led the parade. And they literally were at the front of the parade, but according to the organisers, that was a way of getting them out the way of the parade. It wasn't supposed to be a token of they're symbolising our parade.
I think they were hoping to remove them. Some say it's an arrestable offence because they weren't registered with the protest movement. They've apologised and said that they would do it differently next time.
Just historically, obviously, the optics of having police dragging away people marching in the Pride Parade, even ones who weren't invited or authorised to be there, just, you know, with the historical persecution of the LGBT community at the hands of the police, I think they were rightly sensitive that they didn't want photographs of protesters being dragged away.
Also, some of the placards and posters that they were holding up said some quite extraordinary things. One said, "A man who says he's a lesbian is a rapist." And another one referred to trans women coercing lesbians to have sex with men. So quite offensive stuff. And I also wondered whether, I don't actually know, is there any data to support these claims that, you know, just so hugely offensive to the trans
just
community?
hugely offensive claims.
I'm trying to even unpick what that slogan means. It means that if you're now identifying as a woman and you fancy women, but you were born as a man, that you shouldn't be able to sleep with other women because you're and call yourself a lesbian.
It's this fear that they are hoodwinking lesbians, I suppose. And you see that elsewhere, because Hampstead Heath Ladies Pond is another example where I think they've now allowed trans women to swim in this historically all-female pond. And a lot of women who use it are very unhappy about it. They say it's a safe space for women. But also there was a sort of comments that they don't like the idea of men pretending to be women going there so that they can gawp at young women and at girls, which again is another very offensive opinion, but one that I think people.
But at least there you can see that would be theoretically possible by allowing trans women in. An unfortunate side effect of that is that if you were a male pervert who wanted to go and pervert on women, you could. No, I'm not saying it happens, but I'm saying sure. I'm not saying there's any evidence that actually happens, but it is theoretically possible.
And the reason that this controversy has kind of reared its head again recently is because the government is considering changing laws to make it easier for people to identify as a different gender to the one they were born with, not go through such an arduous process. Of having, at the moment you've got to live as you're in that new gender for 2 years. You've got to see doctors and various things, and so some of these minority anti-trans feminist and lesbian groups think that it's going to become too easy now. Any man will be able to claim he's a woman and invade women's spaces, which they see as the patriarchal society, again, going into these safe women's spaces.
Holly, that's why you introduced this subject with reference to the 1970s feminist movement.
Yeah,
you raised the idea that it might be
find
going back to the 70s. Do you think it will?
I think that infighting is already exists now in 2018, but I do think it's an odd concept to fear trans women in women's spaces when they're probably one of the most vulnerable minorities. There's 2 in 5 victims of hate crime in the last year, 2 in 5 young trans people have attempted suicide, 1 in 8 have been physically attacked by colleagues or customers at work. I just find that shocking. And women are saying that they're scared of these people who just want to live their lives normally.
This is just to provide context. This isn't to support, these anti-trans groups, but as a kind of background to where that attitude is coming from. In the 1970s, 80s, 90s, when you first started seeing, what they used to call sex swap-op stories in the tabloids, a lot of the early trans narratives were quite simplistic and quite geared towards, winning over a hostile public. So there'd be a lot of what we would now see as quite reductive things about, I always knew I was a girl because I like to wear dresses, not trousers, and I like to play with dolls, not trucks. And so that really ran up against this 1970s feminist idea that gender is a construct and that anyone can like anything and, women don't have to do these things, men don't have to do these things. And so because those 1970s groups saw woman as a political construct, their definition of being a woman was someone who has grown up as a woman and has experienced the prejudice that women encounter. So their argument therefore goes that someone who was raised as a boy/man cannot be a woman in that political context because womanhood is entirely defined by your experience in society, not by what you like or dislike. And obviously now we do see far more complex trans narratives, but I think the damage of those old ideas still kind of lingers.
Felicity.
It is interesting, though. Rebecca, you were alluding to the Gender Recognition Act 2004, and I think Scotland is a prime example of a country that's looking into a consultation which would allow people to self-declare their intention to legally change their gender status. So all they would have to say is, I self-identify as a man or a boy, and at that point that would be it. So it would remove barriers such as invasive medical or psychiatric, things like that.
Holly, is this just going too quickly for some people, gay and straight and bisexual, in that, as Rebecca says, trans narratives, as she puts it, are now part of the mainstream discourse in a way that most people, whatever their sexuality, sort of haven't quite got up to speed with yet? And you're seeing this in the Pride March, that there are people who have question marks about trans identity and what it means to be trans, what the process should be, what the laws should be, who want to campaign to say, I'm a lesbian, I've been a lesbian for 40 years, who aren't comfortable with everything. And that sort of is a tension with the Pride movement. Everyone saying we're all together and we all believe in things.
I think you're always going to get that with any time that minority groups need more rights, as with feminism that hasn't reached its goal yet of equality. Every time you call for equality from a minority group, there's going to be a backlash, there's going to be tensions which need to be worked through. But I struggle to see how it's any skin off anyone's nose for someone who really wants to be seen as a man or a woman to do that without having to go through medical tests. And you can't even swap gender without the permission of your husband or wife. It's madness. I think when we look back at it, we'll think it took a long time to get to this point. I think for 2018, for you to have to say that you're mentally ill because you want to become a man, it's outrageous. It's stuff that we would have said when being homosexual was illegal. It's that kind of concept that is baffling to me that still exists now.
Right, Felicity, you're our final contributor this week. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
A load of tripe, but it isn't getting eaten.
Don't smack it.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Get off.
Right, have it. Me and you on countdown.
This is stressing.
Ready? 1, 2, 3.
Look at his face.
It's the chewiness and the cowiness.
If Mum don't like it, you know it's bad. No, it's gonna be sick.
You alright?
This is bad.
That was the Ellis family trying northern delicacy tripe for the very first time on the TV show Back in Time for Tea. Fans of that, I am one, will be encouraged to know that the new series starts on Monday on BBC Two. Felicity, what's the story?
The story is YouGov have released a survey in which they selected 24 foods that tend to be associated with the olden days and asked people when they last ate them and if they never had, if they'd give them a try. And guess what topped the poll? It was tripe. A whopping 69% said they would never, ever let it pass their lips. And then you also had giblets and eel were also in the top 3.
Remind us exactly what tripe is.
Tripe, as I understand it, is the
As heard on the Week Unwrapped.
is the stomach lining of a cow. But I think cows have multiple stomachs, and so there are different types of tripe, and they have quite interesting names, and they just look absolutely vile.
If you've ever been to Italy and some other European countries, you may have seen them in butcher shops. It looks like the underside of a bath non-slip mat.
Yeah, so other countries do eat all kinds of bits of animals, and maybe it's just fashion at the moment, Rebecca, that we don't at the moment. Most of these foods have fallen out of fashion because people think, ugh, that's disgusting. But that's cyclical, isn't it?
Yeah, well, yes, and the fact that the reason that people ate them in the first place wasn't because they were delicious, it was because they couldn't afford anything else.
Yeah.
You know, offal and, you know, the unwanted cut-offs of the richer people was, you know, all that the majority of people could actually eat for a long time. You know, and you see the same thing in the US, like soul food. Stuff like pig's feet and things like that are now considered delicacies were obviously, you know, originally eaten by poor people in the deep south. So there is kind of a global tradition. And then when people start to make more money, then they choose to buy things like chicken and bacon.
Except, I mean, when it comes to hipster foods, there's a big markup, isn't there, in taking an offcut and charging too much for it. So you can see how it only takes a guy with a cool haircut in Shoreditch to start selling us deep-fried pig's trotters, and suddenly everyone will pay 5 times as much and it'll be back on the list.
With oysters, in Victorian times, oysters were pretty cheap, and now they're quite expensive. And I wonder how many people eat oysters because they are this expensive delicacy, not because they actually like the taste. I wonder if eels suddenly became an expensive delicacy, whether we'd all be eating them again.
Well, let's see. Who here has tried jellied eels?
Nope.
No.
Tongue.
A long time ago, when I was little.
What kind of tongue was it?
I don't know, but my dad would buy packets of because it looked like sliced ham, and you'd get sliced tongue, and that was definitely would come out at lunch.
I've tried it in the sort of Jewish salt beef style, and what's distressing is you can still see the lumps on it like it's a tongue from a cow. It's kind of just, I can't. Giblets?
I should out myself as a vegetarian at this point.
Okay.
Save some time.
Nothing on the list.
Hollie, no. Giblets?
No, I've had gizzard. Is that traditional?
If we were having this discussion in 1905, we would be saying what's happened to gizzard consumption. Yeah.
I had it in France. I thought it was fried mushrooms, and it wasn't, but it was delicious.
Okay, let's just go a bit earthier now. Cockles. Surely you owe it to yourself to try some cockles. Even you, vegetarian.
I'm actually from the seaside.
Fish allergy.
You've never had a cockle and you live by the seaside?
Never cockles, no eels. Roll mop, which is something with herring.
Oh, roll mop.
You've never had a roll mop?
I've had roll mop.
Yeah.
I've had roll mop.
Quite like roll mop.
I'm a regular consumer of roll mop, I'd go as far to say.
But the thing I would like to point out about this is that I think in our defence, I think part of the reason we're not all like gobbling these down every single lunchtime is they're not really widely available in supermarkets. You don't see tripe and cockles on the supermarket shelves. And I feel that's what's changed, is that also the fact that a generation ago you'd have been going to the butcher to buy your meat and you'd have seen the entire pretty much carcass of an animal and you could have probably got some bones to boil into a broth and some marrow and this and that. And there was probably a better understanding of the entire animal, and you would get cheap bits and you would know, but now we just want a chicken breast in some polystyrene and then we're safe and we're happy with that. But actually
wanted to introduce kind of a touch-free packaging where squeamish snowflake millennials could just tip their meat into the pan without touching it, which kind of says it all. I think we have just got more squeamish, which I'm fully backing. I don't want to touch raw meat either.
Yeah, I mean, who doesn't cut open the packet and then just slide the contents of the packet into the pan?
I like to give it a good massage with a bit of buttered garlic.
I wonder if some of it is more awareness of food poisoning and things like the BSE scandal, horse meat, E. coli breakouts, whether we're squeamish for a reason. Raw meat isn't as popular. Maybe people don't want to touch chicken because they don't want to get an E. coli.
Yeah, we go for more clinical cuts now. The idea of I think a lot of people would actually be quite unsettled by the idea of turning up to a butcher's and saying, have you got any offal? Can you wrap it in a piece of brown paper and I'll take it home and cook it and eat it? It's just not the way that most of us eat now. And, you know, if you look at recipes in The Guardian, not to pile on The Guardian, but sometimes, you know, they'll have these fancy recipes from fancy chefs and they say, oh, you need this strange cut of beef, ask your butcher. that's not how we live anymore. And so the only way that these foods are going to be brought back into fashion, if it's going to happen,
in a ready meal,
is in the form of ready meal, something that you can get in the supermarket. You can't get rabbit in the supermarket anymore even. These things are going to die out.
Or if Giles Corran comes round to your home, which he's remodelled as a 1970s version of the current one you live in, and gets you all to dress in costume and try it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Who wouldn't want that?
Got a bit of a secret crush on him. He's a bad boy.
I think we're also exposed to far more international cuisine than we've ever been before, and there are ethical implications to that as well. But, we all have our avocados and our quinoa and all our fancy foods that come in from all far-flung corners of the world. But, that again has completely changed. My dad grew up in the 1940s, and, bread and dripping was the treat, and he'd never even heard of pasta. It's a completely different world, isn't it?
It's a good point, Felicity. Maybe I just need to repackage roll mops as an international delicacy, and then everyone will be back on Team Roll Mop. Okay, well, we'll all go off and try some stuff from the list. In the meantime, that is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Felicity Capon, Holly Clemence, and bad girl, Rebecca Gillie. Share your thoughts on today's show on our SoundCloud page, or we are on Twitter @WeekUnwrapped. Please do also write us a review on Apple Podcasts if you like the show. That helps other people discover us. And stay subscribed to hear our bonus edition of Business Unwrapped, a series of bonus shows brought to you by our friends at Barclays Corporate Banking. You can get them and the usual weekly show all delivered to your phone when you subscribe to The Week Unwrapped for free on your podcast app of choice. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.